Boss fights are an important part of video games. Even though their importance has dwindled over time, they're still a major part of how we look at games and how we judge them. But of course, not all games do boss fights as well as others. In this feature, we're going to take a look at boss fights from games released in 2017 that turned out to be rather disappointing. If you disagree with any of our picks, and feel like there were others that we failed to mention, sound off in the comments section below. Spoilers ahead! The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild, Calamity Ganon, Dark Beast Ganon. The Legend of Zelda franchise has always been known for featuring some excellent boss fights. Breath of the Wild came along and changed a lot of things, and that, unfortunately enough, was one of them. There really weren't any boss fights in the entire game that can compare to what we're used to seeing from this series. But the final two-legged battle against Ganon has to be the most disappointing of them all. It was a pretty straightforward fight, not to mention the fact that it was also surprisingly easy. The entire game built up Calamity Ganon as a truly terrifying villain, but the final battle against him just couldn't do that justice. Horizon Zero Dawn, Corrupted Deathbringer. The fight against the Corrupted Deathbringer in Horizon Zero Dawn by itself wasn't all that bad. It just wasn't what we wanted from the game's last boss battle. After spending well over 30 hours to build up both the Eclipse and Hades as the ultimate big bads of the story, Horizon chose to have players battle against just another Deathbringer in the end. It felt fairly anticlimactic, especially considering the fact that some of the other boss battles, such as the ones in the Cauldrons, were excellent. Assassin's Creed Origins, Septimius. The very fact that Assassin's Creed Origins had boss battles was a bit of a surprise for Assassin's Creed fans. But that was something that went hand in hand with the game's revamped combat system. And while most of the boss battles in the game were pretty decent, if not too special, the final battle against Septimius felt like it had been tacked on for no reason. It was essentially just a repeat of our earlier battle against Septimius and just didn't feel worthy of being the game's final boss battle. Neo, Maria. Neo boasted generally good boss design, which is kind of a prerequisite in Souls-style games, but the boss fight against Maria was a major blemish. The boss fight basically tossed out everything you'd learned up until that point in the game, pitting you against a foe who was ridiculously hard to beat. Being challenging is one thing, and it's generally appreciated in a good boss fight, but the battle against Maria was so much more than that. It was a frustrating encounter, and on higher difficulties, she surely was the cause of many broken controllers. Resident Evil 7, EVELINE. Resident Evil 7 features some really good boss battles, which were all able to perfectly capture the same sense of dread and tension that characterized the rest of the game itself. But the final boss battle against EVELINE was, sadly enough, pretty disappointing. It was way too short and surprisingly easy, giving you the sense that the entire ending was a little bit rushed. Its reliance on QuickTime events also didn't do it any favors. Pokemon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, Cyrus. Pokemon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon's boss battles were admittedly much better in comparison to Sun and Moon, but they were still a little too easy. The fight against Cyrus especially was disappointingly easy. When you look at his previous appearances and how hard it was to beat him in Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum, you can't help but be disappointed by his appearance in Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon. Metroid Samus Returns, Metroid boss fights. Samus Returns is an excellent return to form for 2D Metroid games, but it wasn't without its own faults. The game tasks players with hunting down 40 Metroids, which serve as the boss fights of the game to some extent. And while these battles themselves weren't too disappointing, having to do the same thing over and over again became a little repetitive over time. Sure, the game tried to mix it up with some variations, but ultimately the majority of these felt like disappointing cut and paste job. Mass Effect Andromeda, the Archon. Mass Effect Andromeda's Archon was a pretty disappointing villain, especially when you compare him to the likes of Saren and the Elusive Man. And the final fight against him was even more so. After 60 hours of gameplay, players wouldn't have been blamed for wanting a final head-to-head showdown against him, but that just wasn't what we got. All you had to do was basically hit a few consoles and the Archon just crumpled to the floor. Not only was the battle itself a disappointment, his death also felt a little abrupt. Middle-earth, Shadow of War. The Witch King and Sauron. Fighting against the Witch King and Sauron himself should have been absolutely epic. A dream come true for any fan of Tolkien's books, but it was such a massive disappointment. Not only did the game not let you use most of the abilities that you'd accrued over the course of 60 hours, but the boss fight devolved into a game of hide and seek, which was then finished off by, surprise surprise, QuickTime events. It was an especially disappointing ending to the game, made even more disappointing by the fact that players had invested a good 50 or more hours to get to this point. The Evil Within 2, Stefano Valentini. Stefano Valentini was built up as an incredible antagonist during the first half of The Evil Within 2, which is made even more impressive when you consider that he isn't even the game's main villain. The boss fight against him, though, was a bit of a disappointment. His teleportation, for instance, was more of an annoyance rather than being something that provided an actual boss fight, and the entire fight was just a little too easy. The fact that Stefano also died so early in the game, despite the fact that he was among the most interesting characters in the game, was also really disappointing. Wolfenstein 2: The New Colossus, General FRAU Engel. The New Colossus is a great game, and FRAU Engel was an excellent villain, all of which makes your final confrontation against her that much more disappointing. It just felt a little too impersonal. Her death felt a little too easy, like it was unearned, and the fact that it boiled down to a simple button press was, quite frankly, a little insulting to the excellent development the rest of the game had done on her as an antagonist. When you compare this confrontation against previous boss battles in the series, such as the one against Death's Head in the New Order, it just seems even more disappointing. Uncharted: The Lost Legacy, ASAV. You don't expect mind-blowing boss fights when you're playing an Uncharted game, but the final fight against ASAV in The Lost Legacy was still a bit of a disappointment. It basically devolved to you having to do nothing but press the attack button at the right time, which really isn't that difficult when you think about it. By comparison, the final fight against Rafi in Uncharted 4 was so well done. It wasn't too special, but at least it felt like a fitting conclusion. This, on the other hand, really didn't. Knack 2: The Final Boss. Knack 2 was, surprisingly enough, a major improvement over its predecessor in a lot of areas. In spite of that, though, we didn't really expect it to have the best-in-class boss battles or anything like that. The final boss fight of the game, though, was still pretty disappointing. There was no skill required, and it was just a pretty underwhelming encounter all around. Given how much of an improvement Knack 2 was over the first game in so many areas, we don't see why it couldn't have had better boss fights either.
And that'll be about it for this one. If you guys like what we're doing at Gaming Vault, please consider subscribing to our channel, and I'll see you guys on the next video.